Hey, it is Bible Scribe again. Welcome back. I am taking on another viewer request, and this request made by a viewer was I'm titling it Reconciling the Sifting with the Judgment or Final Judgment. And we're going to be mostly in the New Testament. I'll go ahead and read you the request of the viewer because that'll put everything in perspective. But we're going to be talking about some apocalyptic topics in the New Testament and reconciling them in different places. So let's look at that request real quick. I'll bring it up here. The request given was this. Hey, I have a question with regard to the millennium. Revelation 20 seems to put chronology in this order. Second coming, Satan bound plus small judgment plus first resurrection, 1,000 years, Satan released, Gog, Magog, fire judgment from above, great white throne, final judgment, new heavens and new earth. Then this viewer says, but Matthew 25:31, which I put in parentheses here, this is the parable of the sheep and goats. It seems to connect the final judgment and new heaven, new earth to the second coming. The viewer says also 2 Peter 3:10 seems to connect fire judgment from above with the day of the Lord, second coming. Matthew 24:43. And the question, any thoughts on how to resolve this supposed conflict? Any help would be appreciated. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to these passages and we're going to see actually two themes emerge that are consistent. Not only, turn off my little space heater, it's cold in here. We're going to see how not only these two themes are in the passages that we're going to be looking at, but they are consistent throughout the New Testament in different places. We'll look at a few of those other places, but we won't have to go very far to establish this pattern for each of these topics. And those two topics are what I would call the sorting of the righteous and the unrighteous. And that's the same as this parable of the sheep and goats we're going to look at, and a couple other parables that will echo that same thought. And then number two, the final judgment, which is a different event. It's different than this sifting or sorting that we're going to read about of the righteous and unrighteous. So let's move forward and look at that first topic, the sorting of the righteous and the unrighteous. So the viewer mentioned up here in his request that 2 Peter 3:10 seems to connect fire judgment from above with the day of the Lord or second coming. So we're going to read Matthew 24:43 first because I want to actually disconnect it from the 2 Peter 3:10. We're gonna see if it actually talks about fire judgment from above and the day of the Lord in Matthew 24. So let's do that. Let's look at Matthew 24, and I'm actually going to open these in Bible Hub because I like that format for reading. In verse 42, 43, 44 of chapter 24 of Matthew. So this is the Olivet Discourse. So this is the disciples sitting down in front of Jesus and saying, Master, please tell us the signs of your coming and the signs of the end of this age that we are in. And of course, that is in the year 30 AD. And so Jesus gives them this long discourse, Matthew 24. Also, it's in Luke and in Mark. And in the midst of that is this statement, verses 42 and 43 and 44. Watch therefore, for you know not what hour the Lord doth come. But know this, that if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken up. Therefore be also ready in such an hour as you think the Son of Man cometh. So let's just acknowledge that these verses only talk about the coming of the Lord, what Jesus Christ was describing as his own coming. I suppose you could say his second coming, although he didn't use those words. He said that he was going to come back to the disciples because he's there. That's his first coming. He's coming back again. And that was going to be when the man of the house, as it says, the man of the house comes back in judgment. And this is against Israel. So this we know is 70 AD. It's recorded in history for us. So this passage, short as it is, doesn't really connect a fire judgment with this. Although fire was involved in Israel in AD 70, we're going to see that's a little different than what we're talking about when we talk about Revelation 20 and a couple other places. It's a very different thing. So I just wanted to start with that verse because it really plays into what happens during this first set of verses we're going to look at, these parables. So now that we've seen that, let's look at Matthew 25, which is also requested by my viewer. Matthew 25, he says, seems to connect the final judgment and new heaven, new earth to the second coming. So let's take a look at that. Matthew 25 is, let's see, make sure I get the right verses. Verse 31, Matthew 25, 31. Now this is the sheep and the goats parable, and recognize that this is in amongst a bunch of parables, and that there's not just this parable, there's others we're actually going to look at that echo the exact same idea, the same thought. So let's read real quickly here, verse 31, when the Son of Man shall come in his glory, Son of Man being Christ, obviously, and all the holy angels with him, then he shall sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them from one another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats, and he shall set the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. So we're going to now see again and again this idea of when Jesus was telling people, when he was on earth and telling people, I'm coming back very soon, he was saying these things over and over again. For instance, that he would come back with his angels and would sift or sort the righteous sheep of Israel, the righteous of Israel and the Christians, apart from the goats, which were the non-Christians, the non-Israelites, all those who were wicked. And so that's the idea here of a sorting, or I like to call it a sifting of the righteous. And it talks about all through the Old Testament prophecies how the wicked had grown in amongst the house of Israel. All right, so there was still a remnant of true Israel, and the wicked had grown up around them and in them. And so we're going to look at another parable now that says the same type of thing. And this is in Matthew chapter 13, in verse 47. Way down, verse 47. Now this is the parable of the net and the fishes. You may or may not have read this, but all of Matthew 13 is parable after parable after parable. Jesus is giving the disciples and those he's teaching about the kingdom of heaven and what that means, what his kingdom is all about, and what's going to happen. And here in this parable, he says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a net that was cast into the sea and gathered of every kind. Again, this is the idea that we saw before of there's Israelites, but there's also other nations too involved in this. And so it's the good and the bad from the Israelites, meaning the good, meaning those who believed in Christ and accepted God in Christ and were not wicked, versus all the wicked. So the kingdom of heaven is like a net cast into the sea, gathered of every kind, which when it was full they drew to shore and sat down and gathered the good into vessels, but cast away the bad. So it shall be at the end of and this word world is aeon in Greek. It's an age, it's a time period. So this age, the age they were in was the Jewish age, and it was about to end in AD 70, and then began the Messiah age, the age of Messiah, because Christ's kingdom had come. And actually, I take it back. That the age of Messiah should have started when Christ resurrected and went to heaven and sat on the throne next to God, which Acts chapter 2 talks about specifically. So anyway, I just mixed up my dates. But anyway, so they're talking about at the end of this age, which Christ is in the year 30, telling his disciples this, the end of this age, the angels shall come forth, and they will sever the wicked from among the just. This is the sifting we're talking about. and shall cast them into the furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. So this is the same thing as we saw with the sheep and the goats. There's going to be Jesus is coming, and that's AD 70. He comes with his angels. He sifts the sheep from the goats, the righteous from the unrighteous, the good fish from the bad fish, and he throws away the bad, and they're burned in the fire. And that's both going to be a literal and a physical, literal and spiritual burning. All right. Burning in the sense of what happened in AD 70. The temple was burned, and most of the city was burned. The Jews, the temple priests, and all the Jews who were left in the city at the time of the siege ran into the temple for safety. They felt like, oh, that's God's house, it'll be safe. And you can read this in Josephus. And the slaughter was so great in that temple that the blood ran out of the temple. It ran down the stairs like a waterfall. And then the Roman soldiers set fire to the temple. The whole thing burned to the ground. And this was the fiery judgment of the Israelite nation. And again, this is going to be different than the final judgment we talk about in Revelation 20, where all men everywhere are judged. It's different. And so we're going to look at that further. But just to show you that this parable is an echo of that sifting of the righteous and unrighteous people at the time when Christ came in 70 AD to exact judgment upon the Jewish nation. So Matthew 13's parable of the net says that, and then the parable of the weeds is in the same chapter, and it's the exact same concept. And this is in verse 36. So let's go back up just a little bit. Now, the parable of the weeds actually starts in verse 24 of Matthew 13, but he explains it to the disciples so they understand what it means. So we don't have to guess at what this parable means. It's explained in plain Greek, plain English, by Jesus to the disciples, and that is in verse 36. Because it says here, Jesus sent the multitude away, and the disciples came to him asking, "Declare unto us the parable of the tares of the field." And so Jesus answered and said to them, "He that sows good seed is the Son of Man, the field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked." So you have the good seed and you have the tares, the wheat and the tares. The enemy that sowed the tares is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so it shall be in the end of this world. And again, this word world is not what we think of as a globe or earth. It is the word age, aeon in Greek, and it means age, just the end of the time period we're in. And for them in AD 30, the end of that time period was at hand, because Christ was going to heaven to establish his kingdom at that time. It says, "The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, those that do iniquity, and cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth." Now, this furnace of fire mentioned here that's the lake of fire. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about Hades and the underworld. This is the lake of fire, and that the tares would be gathered and sifted out of his kingdom, and because that was what the Israelite nation was made of. It was made of the righteous remnant and all the wicked Israelites who had turned away from God and his promises and from his Messiah, Jesus Christ, whom had gone throughout the cities of Galilee, his whole ministry trying to win the Jews back, the Israelites. But they mostly did not accept him. So this was the sifting of the wicked out of his kingdom. And they were thrown in the lake of fire because of their wickedness and their rejection of him. And there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth, it says in verse 42. "Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father." So the righteous that started his kingdom, the remnant of Israel, and the Christians who accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior in the first century, they are now in the kingdom of their Father. And they were sorted, and they were the righteous. All right, so there's a third parable that also echoes the sifting. And now I'm going to take you real quick to the actual sifting that occurred, because we have that in Revelation. It is specifically spelled out, that actual event in Revelation chapter 14, and it's called the harvest in verse 14. And we'll just read this quickly because it echoes everything we've just gone through, the sifting of the wicked and the righteous. And it happened in AD 70 when Christ came in the clouds with his angels. And I looked, behold, a white cloud. Upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. Now, this is obviously Christ. He's the Son of Man. He has a crown. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, Thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. And he that sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, having a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, which had power over fire, and cried with a loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle, saying, Thrust in thy sharp sickle, gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and cast it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress. So this was the gathering and sifting that's been talked about, that Jesus talked about in all those parables. This actually was occurring in AD 70, and the book of John records it because he was able to view that from a spiritual perspective in his vision that God gave him. So he saw that, this winepress, the terminology the winepress is used in Old Testament and New Testament, and it is always talked about as being this place in Jerusalem where their temple, the temple of Herod, stood, where God was going to judge Israel, and they were squashed like grapes in that temple. They were, like I said, Josephus records that blood ran down the temple steps so thick that it was like water. There was just so many people being slaughtered in there. And then they lit it on fire, and it was burned to the ground as well. So this was literally the winepress of the wrath of God, as stated in the prophets and in this vision of John in Revelation. And that was the time of that harvest and that sorting, the sifting of the righteous and wicked. The wicked were obviously judged very harshly in a very physical sense, and also in a spiritual sense, because they were sent to the lake of fire after death. And so that is what we're talking about when we're talking about the sifting. All that was related to and connected to AD 70. Now, we've gone through those. Now, the second section we're going to talk about is what I'd like to call the final judgment. It is different. And we're going to go to the verse that my viewer mentioned, and that is this right here. And he says, also, 2 Peter 3:10 seems to connect fire judgment from above with the day of the Lord in the second coming. And he references Matthew 24, which we already went to, that didn't seem to reference the fire judgment that he's talking about. So we're going to go to 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10 now. So here we go. Now, just one note, and this might rub some people the wrong way when you read this and you think about this, but almost all scholars who study the early Christian works of the first, century and shortly thereafter, and who have studied all the books of the New Testament and looked, throughout all the records of the early church fathers to who wrote what and who gave authority to what books. Almost every scholar agrees that 2 Peter, the book 2 Peter, was written as late as 140 AD, if not later. And it's because of the references inside, the way it attacks certain arguments that were popular in the 2nd century and not the 1st. And so we do need to recognize that. They also agreed that Peter did not write the book, because obviously if it was written in AD 140, Peter would have been long dead at that time. He was not alive, so there's no way he could have written the book. And in fact, I did a little extra research on this. I looked at some of the early church fathers' writings on the books of the New Testament. And for instance, Irenaeus, he quotes and talks about all the other epistles, or many of the other epistles, including First Peter, but he never mentions that there is a second epistle of Peter, nor does he attribute it to Peter. But it's like, Irenaeus, I believe he was 2nd century as well, AD 150-ish, if I'm not mistaken. But he would have known about this book if it had been, number one, written at the time he was talking about, and number two, if it was acknowledged as authoritative at the time that he was talking about. And so, I'm not trying to cast doubt on the book, but you have to recognize the time period it was written in. Whereas we're going to look at another small quote out of 1 Thessalonians, which almost every scholar agrees was written in 50 AD. So the time frame is pretty different. And so let's just acknowledge that, because I'm going to come to a point later on that will kind of tie into. But to start with the verse that was mentioned by my viewer, let's go to verse 10. Let me see here. I'll pull it up over here. Verse 10. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also, and the works that are therein shall be burned up. Seeing then that these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in all holy conversation and godliness? Look for and hasting unto the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness. So this, in opposition or distinct from what we were talking about before with the sifting of the righteous and unrighteous that Jesus talked about, Jesus was not going around and preaching this type of judgment, this final type of judgment, saying things like that the elements and the earth would be burned up and all the works therein. And then in verse 11, you can see that he's really, this writer is talking about a literal destruction, because he says, seeing that everything that we do will be dissolved, meaning it will be meaningless, and because it will be burned up, is what he's saying. What manner of persons ought you to be in holy conversation and godliness? Because he's saying, this final day of judgment, this apocalyptic event will happen, whereas everything will be destroyed. The heavens, he says, will be on fire and be dissolved. Now, there is some talk among preterists. Most full preterists will say any reference to heavens and earth being destroyed is a reference to the temple. But I would challenge them here to make that case, because you have to make it in light of the fact he's telling these people that they need to be careful what they do, because everything, he's saying essentially, only do things that will last after everything is destroyed, after the whole world is dissolved. And so that's a different thought and a different idea completely from the sifting of the righteous Jesus was talking about, obviously. Now let's look at a little context on this verse, just so we are aware of what 2 Peter chapter 3 is all about. Beloved, I write to you to stir up your minds, that you may be mindful of the words which were spoken by the holy prophets, and of the commandment of us, the apostles of the Lord and Savior, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were since the beginning of creation. Now, I went to that point about the date of when this book was written, this writing, the second epistle of Peter. And I went into those details that scholars have uncovered because this argument right here is specifically in response to something that was happening after AD 70. And after AD 70, some people started to doubt the coming, the talk about the coming of Jesus, because they didn't really understand the significance of what had happened in 70 AD. So there were scoffers, meaning people who didn't believe it had happened and would make fun of the Christians by saying, oh, look, you said Jesus is coming, and look, what's happened? Nothing. Jesus isn't here. And it's exactly what people do today in the futurist and premillennialist camp. So this argument that this writer is making is a second century argument, and that's one of the reasons most scholars, that's just one of the reasons, there's a lot more, but that's one of the reasons most scholars do not attribute this book to Peter and also date it in the second century, because this is the time frame this kind of argument was occurring in Christendom. And so they're saying, where is the promise of his coming? Because since all of the fathers, meaning the fathers of Judaism and the apostles, they all fell asleep, they're saying all things are continuing as they had since the creation. So where's the promise of Jesus coming? This to me definitely smacks of a second century type of writing because of that argument. It says, for this they are willingly ignorant of, by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that was then being overflowed with water perished. So now we're having it's taken us to the flood of Noah, because that's what it's talking about. When the world perished because of water, the whole of the world was destroyed by water in Noah's flood. And he says, but the heavens and the earth which are now by the same word are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. Now this reserved unto fire, that the world would at some point in history be judged by fire, is not only said here. That is a concept that I am now starting to find throughout pseudepigrapha and apocrypha and in the Bible and other places in the Bible, and even the writings of Josephus in the first century. Josephus wrote a book called The Antiquities of the Jews. He tried to document a lot of the beliefs of the Jewish nation at the time, probably because he saw the wars occurring in the first century, and for posterity's sake, he was a historian. He was trying to record as much of his people's history, he was a Jew himself, as he possibly could to preserve it. And one of the things he wrote was, and it's in one of the, I wish I had it. I don't think that I recorded this in my notes. Nope, I didn't record this in my notes. It's in the very first few chapters of Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews. He says that Adam had passed down to his descendants, the original, Adam, the first man, had passed down to his descendants the prophecy that at one time in his future that the world would be destroyed by water, and at another time it would be totally destroyed by fire. And of course, that hasn't happened yet as far as the fire, but the water was the flood of Noah. And it says that because of that prophecy, that the sons of Seth built two pillars on which they could record their knowledge. One was made of brick to withstand the fire judgment, and one was made of stone to withstand the water judgment. Now, we can only assume that Josephus sourced that information from Jews who carried that message down through history. But, why else would he have written it? But that was a common understanding of Jews in the first century and their history. And it's probably in some books that we just that aren't extant in the modern day. And we're talking about books that would have been 5,000 years old, right? Or actually 6,000 years old or more. So that's understandable that we don't have those writings, but Josephus recorded that tradition. And so this statement in 2 Peter 3, that the earth was reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men, is a statement about an event yet in the future. And he says, Beloved, be not ignorant that one day is like 1,000 with the Lord, meaning the Lord is patient. This is not giving us a license to use one day equals 1,000 in all prophecies, so don't do that. But he's saying the Lord is patient, because they're arguing against people that are saying, where is the Lord's coming? Why hasn't it come? Da 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 da. So they're saying the Lord is patient. He can wait 1,000 years. He can wait more. One day is like 1,000 to God. He doesn't care about time. That's what they're saying here. And the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some would count it, but long-suffering to us, so that we would all come to repentance, is what they're saying. And then we have this statement we came to about the day of the Lord coming as a thief in the night, when the heavens will pass away, the elements will melt. And he's saying that the heavens would be dissolved by fire. This is not an event that has happened, nor is congruent with anything in our history. So we can only assume this is future. So, to continue on that vein, I wanted to look up also the great day of the Lord, we mentioned here. And I found that phrase again in 1 Thessalonians 5, but I want to note that scholars' consensus, like almost 100% consensus, is that 1 Thessalonians was written, as opposed to 2 Peter, which was the 2nd century. 1 Thessalonians was written in 50 AD, all right? The mid-1st century. So this is way early. It's before Christ came in 70 AD in the clouds with his angels. And it says, For you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord comes as a thief in the night. So these people would have had a complete understanding about this coming of the Lord that they were expectant for in AD 70. In verse 2 here, you know perfectly the day of the Lord comes as a thief in the night, and when they say peace and safety, sudden destruction comes. Let us not sleep as others, but be sober and watch. So this chapter of 1 Thessalonians, he's telling the people to be vigilant because it was going to happen to them. All right? And this is not the same day of the Lord, final judgment. In fact, I did a word search for the phrase day of the Lord in a search tool that I've got. And man, that's throughout all the Old Testament. And it's for different days throughout the history of the Jewish nation. It wasn't always just one event called the day of the Lord. There's actually a few. So we have to recognize that. The day of the Lord is simply a term that means the day when the Lord will come in judgment. And that happened on Gentile nations in the Old Testament. It happened in AD 70 on Israel, and it will happen in the future. And in fact, the book of Enoch talks about the flood as a day of the Lord, essentially, and says that at that time he took his throne in judgment over earth because of the sin before the flood, and that's when Noah's flood occurred. So, the day of the Lord phrase is not specific to a certain event only, but to multiple events throughout history. So let's recognize that. But I just wanted to show you that in 1 Thessalonians, how different the tone is. It's very imminent, and it's like, be ready because it's coming, and it's coming soon. And that was in 50 AD, and these people lived until 70 AD, so they saw it happen. They saw Christ come in the air with his angels in 70 AD, and the judgment that was exacted upon the wickedness of Israel at that time. Whereas in 2 Peter, like we talked about, it's not imminent. They're saying, people are scoffing, saying, where's the day of the Lord, da 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 da. Well, in the 2nd century, people were doing that. They were making fun of Christians, not recognizing what happened in 70 AD, but they were making fun of Christians for looking in their future to a coming because it had been talked about for so long. And so it's understandable why that is in 2 Peter chapter 3. Now, so I hope that helps. I really truly feel that we, in this request from my viewer, this was two different topics. This sifting and sorting of the righteous, like the sheep and the goats, the wheat and the tares, and the good and the bad fish. And then the other topic that's being talked about is the fire judgment, final fire judgment of earth, which is different. It's in Revelation 20. It is talked about in 2 Peter 3. But then it's also in other places. And to be honest, that topic is something I've been looking at a long time. I'm trying to assemble all the data on it, the information, because like I say down here in my notes, to be continued. I plan on doing a video on this final judgment of the earth. I keep seeing in different prophecies in different places, and it is not connected to Jesus Christ's coming in 70 AD. Is not connected at all to the judgment of Israel. It's talking about all mankind. It's talking about all the works of the earth being burnt in the fire, all the works, everything. And there's prophecy and handed down tradition in the Jewish nation of a judgment of the whole earth by fire, not just the Jewish nation. Those prophecies came from before Israel was established. So just so you know, to be continued, I'm going to do videos on that topic. It's coming. I'm assembling a lot of information. It's going to take me some time. I'm in the middle of it. It's forthcoming. But, just to finalize here, I wanted to touch base on the judgment that we do see in Revelation 20. I'll briefly touch on this because you'll read through it. It's talking about, Satan and the dragon. Satan is put in bonds in Hades. It says for 1,000 years. And that, in my other videos, I've gone through it, but I do feel that 1,000 years was literal from the time of Christ coming in 70 AD, 1,000 years. So in about 1070 AD, Satan was loosed and he's deceiving the nations once again. He's up to his old tricks. And he has a short, quote unquote, time, but he's working hard right now to fight against God in this time period. And so it says, he will go out and deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, all the nations, and bring them against God. Fire will rain from heaven from God and destroy all the nations. And the devil will be cast then into the lake of fire, where the beast and the false prophet, the beast and the second beast from Revelation already are, according to previous in Revelation. And that was all done in AD 70. The beast and the false prophet thrown in the lake of fire in AD 70. So then Satan at this time of judgment will join them. I saw a great white throne, and I saw the dead, small and great, all of them. They were all standing before God, all the dead. Not just like the ones before the time of Christ's first and second coming. Not just them, it was all the dead, and all the books were opened, it says. All the books. There are books in heaven that record all the deeds of mankind, you and me as well. Not just the people before Christ's first coming. And the book of life is opened, and all the dead are judged out of those things written in the books according to their works. And the sea gave up the dead, the abyss gave up the dead in them, and hell and death gave up their dead, meaning Hades and Thanatos in Greek. And they were judged, every man, it says, according to their works. And death and hell, Thanatos and Hades, they are principalities of the underworld. They're thrown into the lake of fire, and that's the second death. Whoever's name is not written in the book of life is also cast into the lake of fire at that time. And then, my viewer talked about the new heavens and new earth. Well, that is talked about in Revelation 21. Now, do I connect these two? Not necessarily, but it could be. And it doesn't really, from a, preterist perspective, it doesn't matter whether you connect them or not, because after Christ came, the new heaven, the Jerusalem we're going to see in chapter 21, that's in the new heaven and new earth, was already established. Mount Zion is a spiritual place, and Jerusalem is there, and it may be connected to the earth in some way, the land, but it's spiritual. You cannot see it. Mount Zion has always been spiritual. The Garden of Eden has always been spiritual. You can't see it. So anyway, just to end with this little brief parlay into this final judgment. The earth is passed away with fire. Everything, all your works that are physical and material, they burn to shreds. And then the final judgment of all mankind is exacted. And this is, I truly am now starting to believe, because of all the different things I'm reading, trying to, like I said, assemble for this next set of videos I'm going to do. This is all in our future. And so anyway, I'll stop there with those things because that's not on the topic of this. But just so you know, that's kind of where these things lay out. And as for my viewer, I hope that this has answered the questions you had about, the sifting of the righteous that was done by Christ in AD 70, and then in contrast to that, a final judgment of all mankind that is talked about in the Bible and other places. It's talking about in the book of Enoch, different prophecies. Josephus talks about it as a tradition of the Jews, that they knew prophecy was saying that the earth would be destroyed by fire, and that is a very final judgment, final thing for the earth and for all mankind. So I hope that clears that up, and I'm happy to take any comments or questions in the comments section. Leave me a like and subscribe if you can. It just builds popularity in the channel. And God bless. Have a great evening.